Well, God has different ways of teaching us, and sometimes we're slow to learn the lessons. God speaks to us when we come to church. God always speaks through his word. His word will never return to him void. His word is a living word, is an active word, is sharper than any two-edged sword. It penetrates even to the dividing of spirit and soul. God speaks on Sundays. God speaks every day of the week through his word as you read it at home. But are you learning? Am I learning? God is teaching us. God speaks to us through the witness and example of fellow believers. You learn an awful lot as you spend time with mature Christians who love the Lord. Are we learning as we spend time in fellowship with other Christians? But God also speaks to us through providence, through the everyday events that happen to us. God organizes our lives, ordains events. God is sovereign. And the things that happen to us in life never ever happen by chance. Things are not just random. God is behind all things. And in his providence, he teaches us. Do we learn to trace his hand of providence? Well, the title of today's sermon is Jacob is Learning. And remember last time we looked at verses 1 to 15 and we saw God's kind providence. Here was a young man. He was one who'd caused havoc in his family through lying and deceit, caused a huge rift between him and his brother, had to flee. But God was so very kind to him. God met him at Bethel. God gave him promises. I will be with you. I will bring you back to this land. You may have to flee, but I will be with you. God met him, and it was an awesome experience. It was so awesome that it brought this young man to worship God and to pledge himself to God. And as he continued on his journey, God's kind providence was very evident because he came to a well. And it just so happened that he met some shepherds there. And the shepherds, they told him that they were from Haran, the very place that he was hoping to get to. His parents had told him, you have to flee, you have to go to Haran in Paddan Aram. And it just so happened that he met shepherds from Haran. And then he asked about his uncle Laban, and they knew him. And then they said, well, his very daughter is now coming out with her flock, a shepherdess. He was in the right place at the right time. He hadn't come too soon. He hadn't come too late. It was the exact time. This was God's kind providence. God was saying to him, you're going to be received into this family. And the wife that you are longing for, the one that you're seeking, you've already found her, Rachel. And God was organizing events that in his mind, everything was just falling into place. But now, in verse 16 to verse 30, the passage that Howard read to us, we see God's chastening providence. God has been kind to him. He's also going to be kind to him. I know I've got a picture of pointing the finger. That could be misunderstood. You see, God is being kind to him. He will suffer discipline, but it's in love. He has to learn things about himself, about his twistedness. He has to learn that you reap what you sow. If you've sowed a life of deception, things will come back on you later. You need to understand that God needs to be feared. You're part of a covenant family. You can't live any old way. God must be feared. And so the loving discipline of God comes to him. And we begin to read about that in chapter 29, verses 16 to 30. I wonder, is he learning? He's certainly learning. We need to learn, don't we, as Christians? Sometimes in our past, when bad things were happening to us, we said, that was Satan. And every time a bad thing happened to us, we said that was the devil. But then as we matured as Christians and grew, we maybe have said, well, possibly the devil could have been using that situation, but I know that even if the devil was, God was orchestrating it for my good. In the past, maybe we said, well, this happened to me because I didn't pray about it. I'm suffering now because I didn't pray. And that could well be the reason. But you know, that's not the only reason. This could well be the disciplining, loving hand of God on me, not just my prayerlessness, but God wanting to teach me a lesson. Because you remember in Hebrews 12, we read that the very purpose of discipline is that it will produce the peaceable fruits of righteousness. Jacob is going to suffer the discipline of God because God wants to produce in him character. He wants him not to be an unrighteous man, but an upright, righteous man. He doesn't want him to live in a shifty manner, but he wants him to be a person of integrity, living in peace, true peace with others, the peaceable fruit of righteousness. When things go wrong, sometimes we blame other people or we blame circumstances in our maturity and in our sinfulness. But when things go wrong in life and things don't go well, it's an opportunity to ask questions. Is God teaching me a lesson? It may not be discipline. All suffering is not discipline. But it may be that God is wanting to teach me something about him, that I would know him in a more intimate and real way. You see, when everything is going well, the tendency is to forget God. But when things are difficult, that's the time that we cast ourselves upon God and pray and learn more about him. So Jacob is learning. My first point is from verses 16 to 20. I want to speak about the dream. You see, surely this man, once he'd met Rachel, had a dream. And his dream was of a better future. He was a young man just like any other young man who had hopes and aspirations for the future. He had plans, I'm sure, for the future. His brother, Esau, had been married for a while. He hadn't had a wife. He was hoping he'd have a wife. He had this dream now. He'd seen Rachel. She was the love of his life. He'd set his eyes upon her. And as we read through this passage, we see how much he loves her. He loves her so much that he's willing to do anything for her, willing to work 7 years for her in order to pay a dowry for her. And that was much more than was ever required in those days. He had a dream because in the past he'd been a cheat. He cheated his own father. He cheated his own brother. Cheated in order to obtain the birthright and the blessing, and everything had gone wrong. The very blessings of God that he wanted, and although he'd received the promises from his father, didn't seem to be in his hand. God at Bethel had reiterated the promises, and now he's in this family, and I'm sure his dream is, are these promises now going to begin to be fulfilled? Am I truly the covenant child, that I'm going to have a wife, and she's going to have children, and through her seed will come eventually the promised one that God has promised will eventually come. God had first spoken to Abraham, in your seed, Isaac will come the promised one. Isaac came, and then it wasn't Esau, but it was Jacob who was the seed, and now it was Jacob's turn to get married, and his hopes were for the future. God had said that a great nation would come through him. The land would be his. All the promises of God were now his. He was dreaming of a better day with his wife. Now, you know the complication in the passage. Laban has 2 daughters. And normally, the older one would be given away first. But we read of Leah, she was very plain, verse 17. Her eyes were delicate, whereas Rachel was beautiful of form and of appearance. He evidently didn't want the older one. He didn't want somebody who was plain. His eyes were weak. Maybe he had a problem with her eyesight. We don't know what that means. He wanted the one who was attractive. He was drawn to her. She was very beautiful. Do you remember Abraham had a very beautiful wife, Sarah? His own father, Isaac, had a very beautiful wife, Rebecca. And he's drawn to Rachel. There's nothing wrong in this. We can't say that he's motivated by lust. Some people, some commentaries have said that this man is a lustful young man. I would say the very passage gives the absolute opposite impression. We're told very clearly that he loved her. Verse 20. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed only a few days to him because of her lust for her? No, because of her love. He had genuine love for her. And so this was his dream. This was his dream wife. And he was looking forward to better days. But soon the reality would set in that days were not going to improve. It wasn't going to be happily ever after. Ahead were going to come days of conflict. You know the story well, how he ended up marrying both Leah and Rachel, 2 wives. Endless rivalry between them. Conflict in the marriage. Pain. Agony. And the one that he loved so much was to be the one who would actually introduce idolatry into the family. It was Rachel that was found to have an idol. His dream was an illusion. Yes, he would become an inheritor of the promises of God, but God's disciplining hand was upon him. He lived for years in deceit and deception. He lived a twisted life for years. And God, through this deception that he's now going to receive, is going to teach him various lessons. He's going to have a taste of his own medicine. Now, what do we say to ourselves this morning? It's not wrong to have plans for the future. It's not wrong to have dreams for the future. You may think about the career that you want and the progression that you want to make, and that's not wrong. You may think about another person, a friendship, a relationship. You might think about the future time with the grandchildren. You may have a dream about where you're going to live and what you're going to do. You might have thoughts and plans about retirement. It's not wrong to have dreams and plans and hopes. But if these things replace God, you're in trouble. You see, he had been living practically without God until he met God at Bethel. Years. And as he goes on, he's surely just wanting life for himself. And God is going to discipline him to teach him, you need to depend upon me. You can't work out your own future and organize things the way you want them to go. You have to depend upon me. I wonder, has your future not turned out as you expected it to be? We can have dreams, can't we? Dreams for the family, dreams and plans for different parts in our life, but sometimes things don't just turn out the way we expect them too. But that doesn't mean that God isn't at work. In fact, God may just be at work in the things that go wrong to draw us near to himself. He's teaching us lessons through the difficulties that happen to us. So we need to submit then our dreams to him. But secondly, let's look at this, verses 21 to 24, the deception. As I said, the custom of the day was that the father would give the oldest child. But you know, it was for Jacob to go and ask. He asks not for the older child, but he asks for the younger child. And Laban seems to agree, although if you look at Laban's response, he's not a definite yes there. Perhaps there's already cunning in his mind. He's going to trick him. But eventually, Jacob, having worked 7 years, he goes to Laban, and we read in verse 21, he says this, "Give me my wife, for my days are fulfilled, that I may go into her." Now, some would say that's a proof of his lust. This is a very crass statement. If you were to put this in the Good News version, or if you were to put this into a very general version, it would sound to our ears something quite shocking. But it wasn't like that, you see. It was the father who had to bring his daughter to the tent of the young man and give him to her to lie with her in order that they would be married. That was the custom. And so he's simply asking that custom should be fulfilled. I wonder, had Laban the intention all along of deceiving Jacob? When initially he said to him, "You've been with me for 1 month in my family, tell me what your wages are," was he already trying to draw him into some sort of contract to become obligated to him? He wasn't actually genuine in saying, "Tell me what your wages are." He was already cunning at that point, possibly. But it could be that Laban started out with a very genuine heart, as often happens in life, and people change. Perhaps he was really thrilled to see his nephew, threw his arms around him, was so pleased as much as Rachel was pleased. A member of the family had come, and was so glad that he was working for him, and it was all genuine. But the heart of man is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. And as he sees himself prospering, and as he sees over those 7 years, Jacob working so hard for him, his mind changes. He thinks, well, I'll give him, first of all, my older daughter. I'll give Leah to him. And then, having tricked him, I'll ask him to work another 7 years. And so I've got him for 14 years. And that means greater prosperity for me. You know, we'll never know when that deceitfulness began in his heart, whether it was there at the beginning, when Jacob first arrived, or it grew during those 7 years. But what we can say is this, is that Jacob is suffering a law that's given in the Bible. You do reap what you sow. If you sow to the carnal nature, there's a law of God that says you will reap. You'll reap death to your soul. But if you sow to the spiritual nature, to the Spirit of God, you reap spiritual benefits. God will not be mocked. That's the lesson that he's learning. God will not be mocked. But maybe you're thinking about this situation. How on earth could he be deceived? How on earth could it be that he would get the wrong woman? Surely on the night that he was lying with her, he would realize that this is not Rachel, but it's Leah. Maybe you'll say the Bible can't be believed, this is ridiculous. But if you think about it, this was a feast, and in all feasts there was much drinking. In fact, some people say that the word which Laban uses here in the Hebrew does mean a drinking feast. We know that it was going to be seven days of feasting. And when a man has drunk too much, his perception is very different. Now, it doesn't tell us he was drunk. but we can be sure he did drink a lot. But also, remember this, there was no electricity whatsoever. I don't know if you've been in a place where there's no electricity. It's inky black. It's probable that at those times that women always wore veils. Some have said that Rachel and Leah maybe for a long time had just had a little slit where their eyes could be seen, and that's why it mentions about the eyes of Leah being frail. But he must have seen Rachel because he saw her form. Some have said he probably didn't have much access to the two of them over those 7 years. Who knows? Certainly after 7 years, a person's appearance changes. That's a long time to wait. If somebody starts out at 15 and they become 22, or if they start out 18 and 25, they're different in looks. We're not told all the reasons. She's veiled, it's dark, probably too much drink, late at night, intense, perhaps whispers, and he sleeps with the wrong person. What we do know is that he thinks he's gone to bed with Rachel and he wakes up with Leah. What a shock that must have been. The one who deceived has now been deceived. This is a big deception. He's been duped. What do we learn from this? What does this say to us? Well, first of all, I think we need to be honest about human nature. We're born in sin and shapen in iniquity. And human nature is such is that we start to tell lies as we get older. We're less honest about the truth. We say half-truths. And sin as it grows can lead to a person committing great deception. What about our politicians? Do you trust them? Nobody seems to be able to trust a politician today. Why? Because it seems so easy and so commonplace for them to make pronouncement one day and the next day say the complete opposite or undo it. And there's deceit. There's lies, deliberate lies. There's pulling the wool over the eyes of people continually. And it's so sad, isn't it? That's human nature. Now, what does that mean to us? First, we need to say, Lord, I don't want to be like that. Lord, deal with me. If there's anything twisted in me, deceptive in me, Lord, deal with me, that I'll be upright and true and help me in the little things. We need to start there, don't we? It's when we go wrong in the little areas, then they become bigger and bigger. Lord, help me not to be deceitful in that tiny little area. It may be small, but help me to honor you. He who is faithful in little things, Jesus said, will be honored. But what about our relationships with other people? Well, it doesn't mean we go around distrustful of everybody. That's not a healthy way to. Relationships are built on trust. We ought to be people who trust others, but at the same time, we need to be people who are prudent, cautious, and wise. Jesus said to his disciples, "Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves." You've been saved. You're my children. You belong to me. You're on the right path. But you're going out into this world where people will devour you. They'll use the tongue to get one over on you. They'll hurt you. They'll ruin your character. They'll speak evil about you. They're wolves. I'm sending you out amongst wolves. Therefore, be wise as serpents, but innocent as doves. Continue to be transparent and genuine. Be like a dove, but also be like a serpent. Be wise in the world in which you're living. And that means much prayer. So we thought this morning about the dream. We thought about the deception. But lastly, thirdly, the discipline. Verses 25 to 30. Look at verse 25. So it came to pass in the morning that, behold, it was Leah. And he said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? Was it not for Rachel that I served you? Why then have you deceived me?" What a bitter pill to swallow. He was rightfully angry. He was rightfully beside himself. But I wonder when he says these words, why have you deceived me? I wonder if he begins to reflect upon the things that he has done. Laban says to him, it must not be done so in our country to give the younger before the firstborn, but that's no justification, is it? That doesn't let Laban off the hook. Laban is deceived, but also Leah's been complicit in it. She's deceived as well. It's not only Laban that he'll be angry with, but he'll be angry with Leah for agreeing with her father. But I wonder if he ever thinks this. You have done to me what I have done to my father. You swapped one sister for another. It was an identity switch. I swapped myself for my brother, an identity switch. Do you remember when he pretended to be Esau? You deceived me at night. When my bride was veiled and could not see, I deceived my father who was blind and could not see. You persuaded Leah to be complicit in the act. My mother persuaded me. The deception was all over the rights of the firstborn. You said that it should be Leah that would be given to me, and my deception was the same about the firstborn. I wonder if he's starting to say, I have reaped what I have sown. As I have done, so it has been done to me. Surely Jacob is beginning to learn. This is the loving discipline of God. Whom the Lord loves, he disciplines and scourges every son. If a child of God is without discipline, he is not a child of God. All children of God receive discipline from a loving heavenly Father. This is him learning that he can't live freely sinning and just get away with things. But look, the story continues, verse 27. Laban says, fulfill her week, and we will give you this one also for the service which you will serve with me still another 7 years. So after this week of feasting, this marriage week, when he's with Leah, he will be given Rachel. He will. But he has to serve another 7 years for her. Now, is he accepting the discipline of God? I would suggest yes. Why? Because he doesn't put Leah away. If I was there, my first thought would be, see, I'm not having her. You've deceived me. I didn't realize I'm not having her. You've been unjust, but he doesn't do that. He accepts the discipline of God. He realizes that he's had sexual intercourse with her. He must now look after her. She cannot be left bereft. And he's in this awkward situation now of having 2 wives. And in the Bible, wherever there's polygamy, there's always sorrow. But he also accepts the terms that Laban gives. You might say, well, he's got no choice in the matter, but there's no protest here, is there? When he says another 7 years, he's been humbled. He accepted. Jacob is learning. He's accepting the discipline of God. And in verse 30, we read this. Jacob also went into Rachel, and he also loved Rachel. But then we read, he loved her more than Leah, and he served with Laban still another 7 years. And in verse 30, the problem's announced. He's loving one wife more than another. You could say you can't blame him. That's the one he'd chosen. But this is the start of a real problem of sadness, rivalry between the two. Sin always has negative consequences. So what do we say? Well, just to recap on the 3 points this morning. First of all, the dream. The dream was an illusion. Everything would work out well, happily ever after. It was an illusion because he hadn't put God in the mix. The deception was a wake-up call to him. What was happening to him was God waking him up. And the discipline was humbling, but was to work for his ultimate good. What about us here this morning? If we're children of God, God's hand is upon us. And we're to learn from every event that happens in our lives. We're not to be too introspective and turning around every little thing that happens and say, this must mean that, that must mean the other. But the big things that happen in life. And we're to say, Lord, in this big issue, Lord, what are you trying to teach me? Draw me closer to you. And many have testified in times of illness that they found God in a way that they'd never known before. Maybe they were backsliding. Or in a family bereavement. Or in a family tragedy. It's caused them to cast themselves upon the Lord. May this situation, Lord, work for my good, but work for your glory. May I learn the lessons. You love me, and you discipline me in love. Lord, teach me your way. Amen.